So yeah, I'll just talk about the sort of long history of the AFL and later AFL-CIO's attempts to control and influence the labor movements of Latin America. Um, we have obviously Kim Sipes can speak a lot to this history as well. I see Rob McKenzie is on the call, who's also written an important book called El Golpe about AFIELD's involvement in Mexico specifically. Um, so we have a lot of experts here in this meeting. But so I'll go back to, the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The labor movements of Latin America followed a kind of revolutionary style of organizing, sort of anarcho-syndicalists, seeing unions as a vehicle for revolution, similar to the labor movements of Spain and Italy, while the US labor movement also had a lot of radical tendencies, including anarchist tendencies in the late 19th, early 20th century. Um, but by the early 1900s, the AFL, American Federation of Labor's style of pure and simple conservative trade unionism kind of came to dominate the US labor movement. And the AFL's involvement in Latin America kind of started, you could say, after the Spanish-American War in 1898, when the United States took control over Puerto Rico and Cuba, and the AFL hired Santiago Iglesias to be its main organizer on those two islands, Puerto Rico and Cuba. Iglesias was a Spanish-born Puerto Rican cabinet maker and labor activist who, in the early 20th century, was sort of the AFL's main organizer for Latin America. And then roughly a decade after the Spanish-American War, during the 1910s, with the Mexican Revolution, workers all around on both sides of the US and Mexico border were organizing with the industrial workers of the world, more radical, kind of left-wing, class-conscious labor movement that was a rival of the AFL. And AFL leader Samuel Gompers, along with President Woodrow Wilson and Wilson's administration, wanted to try to temper the radical impulses of the Mexican Revolution, particularly within the Mexican working class, and wanted to drive them away from the IWW. And at the same time, in Mexico itself, the constitutionalist faction in the Mexican Revolution also wanted to establish a more kind of bureaucratic, efficient trade union model, similar to that of the AFL, and try to sort of pull the Mexican labor movement away from anarcho-syndicalism. So in May of 1918, the constitutionalists in Mexico founded the CROM, which was the Regional Confederation of Mexican Workers. And only 6 months after that, the CROM partnered with the AFL under the direction of Samuel Gompers and with the support of President Woodrow Wilson to create a new inter-American labor organization, which they called the PAFL, the Pan American Federation of Labor. It was founded in Laredo, Texas in late 1918. Primarily the AFL and CROM in Mexico were the main bodies that were part of the PAFL, but there were also union representatives from Guatemala, El Salvador, Costa Rica, and Colombia. The AFL was really pretty much in charge of the Pan American Federation of Labor. Gompers served as the president of the Pan American Federation of Labor. A lot of what it focused on was questions of immigration, of immigrant workers coming from Mexico. And it was also calling for better treatment of workers across the whole Western Hemisphere. But the real central purpose of the PAFL was to counteract the radical tendencies in the labor movements of Latin America, especially in Mexico. And Santiago Iglesias, the AFL's main representative in Puerto Rico, who I mentioned before, was sort of the main driving force of the PAFL. And he explained that the whole purpose of the PAFL was, quote, that it was meant to be, quote, an instrumentality through which constructive trade unionism can gain ascendancy in Latin America, thus saving the US trade union movement from a continuing battle at its back door with a most destructive and revolutionary labor movement. So really just trying to, again, water down and make, spread this sort of so-called pure and simple business union model of the AFL into Latin America. In 1924, Samuel Gompers, who was president of the AFL and of the PAFL, died of heart failure actually in San Antonio, Texas, on his way back from a PAFL meeting in Mexico City. And with Gomper's death, the PAFL became a lot more inactive and was more or less just a paper organization for the next few years until it kind of fizzled out in the 1930s. But meanwhile, then in 1936 in Mexico, the Marxist Union leader Vicente Lombardo Toledano founded the CTM, the Mexican Workers' Confederation. And although the CTM would later become associated with corrupt company unionism, Charo unionism, in its early years, in the late 30s, the CTM was actually a pretty dynamic, militant, class-conscious union federation, sort of similar to what the CIO was in those days in the United States. And under Lombardo's leadership, the CTM helped to nationalize Mexico's railroads and oil industry. And in 1938, the CTM, under Lombardo's leadership, brought worker organizations from 13 different Latin American countries together in Mexico City to found a new regional labor organization called the CTAL, the Confederation of Latin American Workers, which welcomed in leftists, communists, was explicitly opposed to Yankee imperialism, and it was led by Latin Americans. So basically, this new Confederation of Latin American Workers supplanted the previous Pan-American Federation of Labor that had been dominated by the AFL. And the Confederation of Latin American Workers really was of, by, and for Latin American workers. So naturally, the AFL was pretty upset about this, but this was in the 1930s, the period of Franklin Roosevelt's good neighbor policy of non-intervention in Latin America. So there wasn't a lot the AFL could do about it at the time. But a few years later, at the end of World War II, U.S. foreign policy shifted away from the good neighbor policy as the Cold War started to begin. And AFL leaders saw this as a politically opportune moment to wreck the Confederation of Latin American Workers, to divide it through red baiting and trying to create a new anti-communist and AFL-dominated hemispheric labor organization like the old PAFL. So to do this, to basically destroy the Confederation of Latin American Workers, in 1946, the AFL hired Serafino Romualdi to the newly created position of AFL Inter-American Representative. Now, Romualdi was originally from Italy, and he was an anti-fascist who opposed Mussolini, and it was because of his opposition to Mussolini that he had to flee to the US in the 1920s. But he was also strongly anti-communist. When he was in the US, he worked for the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, their communications department, because the union had many Italian members. And during World War II, Romualdi traveled across South America on behalf of the US government to do anti-fascist propaganda work within Italian immigrant communities in countries like Brazil and Argentina. And so along the way, he learned Spanish, and he developed many contacts across Latin America. And then near the end of World War II, after the fall of Mussolini from 1944 to 45, Romualdi was back in his home country in Italy, working for the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime intelligence agency that preceded the CIA. But he was only there with the OSS for a year. Then he returned to the US to his job with the ILG, and then he became the AFL's Inter-American representative. And so between 1946 and 48, Romualdi was traveling all around Latin America, and he was supported by the State Department and the different labor attaches at U.S. embassies across Latin America, convincing different union federations to break from the more left-wing Confederation of Latin American Workers. Again, using red baiting, saying, that they're allowing in communists, they're tolerant of the Soviet Union, et cetera, and sort of using these Cold War politics to convince workers' federations to want to split from the Confederation of Latin American Workers. And one of the first ones to do so, to actually break with the Confederation of Latin American Workers, was the Peruvian Confederation of Workers. And the Peruvians in January of 1948 hosted a conference in Lima for the Western Hemisphere's anti-communist union federations, including the AFL, to found yet another new regional organization called the CIT, the Inter-American Confederation of Workers, to be a rival to the more left-wing Confederation of Latin American Workers. And this was all engineered by Romualdi on behalf of the AFL and the State Department. And then 4 years later, the CIT was reconstituted as ORIT, the Inter-American Regional Organization of Workers, basically the pro-US anti-communist regional labor federation that supplanted the Confederation of Latin American Workers. And then throughout the 1950s, Romualdi continued working with the State Department and the CIA to undermine the more sort of left-wing, class-conscious worker movements across Latin America. One of the most famous examples, of course, was Guatemala. The General Confederation of Guatemalan Workers was led by leftists, and they were allies with democratically elected president, reformist president, Jacobo Arbenz. Arbenz was infamously overthrown in a CIA-sponsored coup in 1954 because he wanted to implement an agrarian reform program, which angered foreign multinationals like the United Fruit Company. And the AFL and Romualdi backed the coup, in part because they wanted to get rid of the General Confederation of Guatemalan Workers, this leftist-led labor federation in the country. So the AFL, with Romualdi's, Romualdi as the main person in charge, financed this guy in Guatemala called Ruben Villatoro, who was started a small anti-Arbenz group called the Union of Free Workers. And members of this group, including Villatoro himself, participated in the coup when it happened in 1954. With, again, this particular group was supported by the AFL. And Romualdi seemed to be in on the CIA coup plot. A document I found in the archives was a letter from him to the AFL leaders just a few weeks before the coup in Guatemala, where Romualdi wrote that there was, quote, reason to believe that the last word on Guatemala has not yet been spoken. And he continued, quote, extraordinary events are likely to occur in the very near future, with the possible result that the communist influence in the government will be wiped out for good. So he kind of knew what was going on. We can surmise that he was, in the loop with the CIA and others on the overthrow of Arbenz. And then after the coup, Romualdi traveled to Guatemala. He tried to put this guy he had been backing, Ruben Villatoro, in charge of a new labor federation. But of course, the military regime that had taken over wouldn't tolerate really any type of union movement, not even a AFL style, pure and simple business union movement. By the time of the 1959 Cuban Revolution, the AFL and CIO had merged. And in response to the Cuban Revolution, the Kennedy administration started the Alliance for Progress, this program to give billions of dollars in military and economic aid to anti-communist Latin American governments in the hopes of preventing more Cuban revolutions from happening. And AFL-CIO officials proposed at this time a new training project for Latin American unionists to be like the labor arm of Kennedy's Alliance for Progress. And by 1962, this proposed training project was in operation, known as AFL, the American Institute for Free Labor Development. AFL was supported not only by the U.S. government, but also by various U.S. corporate executives who had business interests in Latin America, like J. Peter Grace, head of the W.R. Grace Corporation, a U.S. conglomerate with over a century of involvement in Latin America, a lot of it notorious involvement of exploiting Latin American workers. Grace became the chair of AFL's board of trustees, and other corporate executives were on the AFL's board. And Romualdi was tapped to be AFL's executive director. So AFL would be the AFL-CIO's most significant foreign operation during the late 20th century. It received hundreds of millions of dollars from the U.S. government, particularly from the U.S. Agency for International Development. and later also from the National Endowment for Democracy. And it was almost certainly working in close cooperation and coordination with the CIA. Many of AFLD's leaders were reputed to be CIA agents. AFLD focused on training programs, labor education programs within Latin American countries, but also brought select groups of Latin American union leaders to Washington, D.C. for a more advanced training school. And later it was moved to Front Royal, Virginia, and then later again moved to Silver Spring, Maryland. The trainings focused on business union types of contract negotiation and grievance handling and stuff like that, but also a lot of tips and tactics on how to keep leftists and anti-imperialists out of unions. They would do like role plays where they would rehearse what it would be like if you were in a union meeting and a leftist started speaking up and talking about Yankee imperialism and how to shut them down and tell them to shut up and go away. That was the kind of things the Latin American unionists were learning in AFLD's training programs. AFLD also had a social projects department doing small scale community development programs like building health clinics and work community centers and setting up worker co-ops and things like that across Latin America to try to, this is part of the battle for hearts and minds, trying to entice workers to side with the more anti-communist pro-US unions. And especially prominent was AFLD's worker housing project program, which lasted until the late 1970s, where they would build affordable worker housing projects in overcrowded cities across Latin America. But this was often controversial because AFLD didn't always deliver the number of housing units as promised, or construction would be delayed several months or years. And only members of the ORIT affiliated unions, the pro-US unions, could move into these housing units. And reportedly, to apply to live in any of these AFLD housing projects, you had to fill out a lengthy questionnaire asking all kinds of questions about your union and the politics of your union leaders, things that had nothing to do with your housing needs, but was clearly designed to like provide intelligence to the US, to the CIA, et cetera. And AFLD was most infamously implicated in several CIA-sponsored coups and destabilization campaigns between the 1960s and 80s, or even early 90s, targeting left-wing labor movements and left-wing governments in Latin America. There was a lot of examples that I talk about in my new book that was mentioned, Blue Collar Empire. But so I won't go over all of them, but one famous example was the Brazilian coup in 1964, where the progressive president João Goulart was overthrown by the military with full CIA US support. A year before the coup, AFLD had trained a special all Brazilian class of like 33 union members, all from Brazil. And many of the graduates of that training class were involved in the coup and the aftermath of the coup. When the new regime took over several Brazilian unions, they sent in trustees, or they called them interveners, to purge Brazilian unions of all leftists or sympathizers with Goulart, the president who had been overthrown. And it was the AFL graduates who were these actual trustees or interveners conducting these purges. One of AFLD's top officials, Bill Doherty, openly bragged not long after the coup, saying our own graduates were involved in the clandestine activities that led to the coup. Another example, the 1973 Chilean coup against Salvador Allende, which, of course, very famous or infamous. In the run-up to that, AFLD was supporting gremios, these associations of middle-class professionals, not quite really unions, professional associations, including engineers in the copper mines, shopkeepers, physicians, truck owners, and operators, and AFLD worked with the CIA to fuel anti-Allende strikes that these gremios were doing that created havoc in the Chilean economy and gave General Augusto Pinochet the pretext to take over. And then in the 80s, AFLD was working with Reagan administration to support the counterinsurgency wars in Central America, trying to undermine the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, as well as putting up lots of money into propping up anti-left centrist politicians and unions in El Salvador, and backing a limited land reform program in El Salvador that ultimately was killed by the Salvadoran right. But in the 80s, there was a major backlash from the US labor rank and file, protesting AFLD and the AFL-CIO's involvement in Central America and support for Reagan's foreign policy. And because of the rank and file organizing and uproar, that several national union presidents from within the AFL-CIO created the National Labor Committee in support of democracy and human rights in El Salvador, which was a group that supported the more militant trade unionists in El Salvador who were facing violent repression, and organized for an end to US military aid to El Salvador and to the Nicaraguan Contras. So by the 90s, then, when new leadership took over the AFL-CIO in 1995, AFLD had earned a pretty negative reputation. So it was shut down and then rebranded really as the Solidarity Center in 1997, which still exists to this day. Is still the AFL-CIO's sort of international face. It's active in 60 countries around the world. And it was said at the time that the Solidarity Center was a break from the past, a break from AFLD, but it is still funded primarily by the State Department, by USAID, the NED, National Endowment for Democracy, the same government entities that were funding AFLD. I have the most recent numbers that I've found from 2020, where the Solidarity Center had $42 million in total finances, and of that 42 million, 38.8 million, almost everything, came from federal grants, including 22.6 million from the National Endowment for Democracy and $14.9 million from USAID, only $300,000 from the AFL-CIO itself. So it's still essentially an arm of the US government more than an arm of the AFL-CIO. And there's a lot of questions I think folks probably have about the Solidarity Center.